Okay, today we are going over section 2.5, properties of numbers. So we have properties of real numbers, and for every real number a, b, and c, that is actually going to apply to all of the properties that we discuss. So the first property we have is a plus b equals b plus a, and that is the commutative property of addition. Okay, so what that's saying is we can switch the order and it will still give us the same thing. So let's look at an example. So for our example, we have 3 plus 7 equals 7 plus 3. So 3 plus 7 on the left side, switch the order, 7 plus 3 on the right side. They both give us 10. Since 10 equals 10, we know that addition is commutative. Our next property is the commutative property of multiplication. So just like addition, we want to be able to switch the order. So a times b is equal to b times a. So if we look at an example, again, let's just use 3 and 7. So if we have 3 times 7, we want to know if that equals 7 times 3. 3 times 7 is 21, and 7 times 3 is also 21. So multiplication is also commutative. Okay, so our next property is the associative property of addition. And one thing I want y'all to remember about the associative property of addition is that it is the grouping property. Okay, so grouping meaning your parentheses. So our first one, we have a plus b in parentheses plus c equals a plus, and then in parentheses b plus c. So we want to know if order doesn't matter. So let's look at an example. So we have in parentheses 6 plus 4 and then plus 5, and we want to know if that equals 6 plus in parentheses 4 plus 5. So on the left, 6 plus 4 would give us a 10. 10 plus 5 is 15. Using our order of operations on the right, we would add 4 plus 5 first, which would give us 9. Then we would add 6, which also gives us 15. So we know addition is associative. So use your grouping. It doesn't matter which order you add them, you'll get the same thing. We also have the associative property of multiplication. Okay, so just like with addition, we're looking at our grouping. So with multiplication, if we multiply the first two terms and then multiply it by the third term, or we can multiply the second and third term and then multiply that by the first. So let's look at an example. So if we add 6 times 4 and then times 5, or 6 times 4 times 5. So 6 times 4 is 24, 24 times 5 is 120. And then if we did on the right side, 4 times 5 is 20, times 6 is 120. So we get 120 equals 120. So that is associative. Our next property is the identity property of addition. Okay, so for addition, our identity is 0. So we are wanting to know what can we add to any number, and it'll give us back that number. So the only answer for addition would be 0. If we add nothing or we take away nothing, then we'll be left with the original. So if we showed an example, if I had 9 plus 0, that would give me back the original number, 9. And we also have the identity property from multiplication. That one's a little bit different. So multiplication, if we want to multiply by a number, and it always has to give us back the original number, that would be multiplying by 1. Okay, so anything multiplied by 1 will give you back the original. So if we have our example, if I have 6 times 1, it gives me back my original number, which is 6. Next property is the inverse property of addition, and it states for every a, there is an additive inverse negative a, such that a plus negative a equals 0. So if you're given a, and you need to find its additive inverse, all you need to do is switch the sign. So if it's positive, it would become negative. If it was negative, it would become positive. So you want them to have the same distance away from 0 so that when you add them together, it equals 0. So if I look at an example, if we have 5 plus its additive inverse, negative 5, it would give me 0 because we're starting with 5, we're taking 5 away, and we'd be back at 0. Okay, so the inverse property of multiplication states for every a where a does not equal 0, there is a multiplicative inverse 1 over a such that a times 1 over a is equal to 1. Okay, so we want the multiplicative inverse is where we make a into a fraction. So you flip it. So if you wrote a as a fraction, it would be a over 1. And then flipping it, it would then become 1 over a. So when you multiply a times 1 over a, remember you multiply straight across, so you would end up taking a and dividing it by itself. So any number divided by itself would give you back 1. So if we look at an example, if we have 5 times its multiplicative inverse 1 over 5, that'd be 5 divided by 5. It would give us a 1. Okay, now we looked at the distributive property the other day, so we have two options here. Our first one is a times the quantity b plus c. If we distribute out that a, we would get ab plus ac. And if we looked at an example of that, we'd say 5 times the quantity 4 plus 2, and that is equal to 5 times 4 plus 5 times 2. So we're distributing that 5 to the 4 and the 2. Now, the only thing different in this next one is that there is a subtraction sign. So it's going to work the same way. So if we have a times the quantity b minus c, it's going to equal, if we distribute out that a times b minus a times c. So again, 5 times the quantity 4 minus 2, we have 5 times 4 minus 5 times 2. Okay. Our next property is the multiplication property of 0, and it states for every real number n times 0 equals 0. Okay, so anytime you multiply by 0, it's always going to give you back 0. Okay, so our example, if I took negative 35 and multiplied it by 0, again, we already said anything times 0 gives us 0. Our next property is the multiplication property of negative 1. And it states for every real number n, negative 1 times n equals negative n. Okay, so you would flip the sign of whatever n is. So for our example, we have negative 1 times negative 5. So negative 5 would be our n. And on the right side of our equal sign, it has negative n. So we would flip the sign, and now it becomes positive 5. You can also think of it as when we're multiplying two negatives, you know it's going to be a positive. Okay, so in your homework, you're going to have a couple of problems where it's wanting you to name the property shown below. Okay, so for our first one, we have 3 times a equals a times 3. Okay, so we are looking for a property that only switches the order. So that property would be the commutative property of multiplication. Alright. So again, just switching the order. Oh, that says addition, but it should be multiplication. And then our second one, we have p times 0 equals 0. So if we want the property that when you multiply anything by 0, it equals 0. So you have the multiplication property of 0. Okay, so on these, again, you're just naming the property. So on number 3, we have 6 plus negative 6 equals 0. So whenever we're adding opposites, that would be the inverse, and this is addition, so it would be the inverse property of addition. Okay, again we have an inverse, z and 1 over z, so that would be multiplication. So our only option for that property would be the inverse property of multiplication. Our last type of problem that we're going to see on the homework is to justify each step. So what it's going to do is it's going to give you a problem, and it's going to work out each step for you, but it wants you to say how to go from step to step. So if we start out with 3x minus 4 times the quantity x minus 8 and move to 3x minus 4x plus 32. What has changed here is that we have distributed that negative 4 to the x and to the negative 8. Okay, so for A, that would be the distributive property. Okay, so again, we distributed our negative 4 to the x and to the negative 8. Next, we want to look at how we go from that 3x minus 4x plus 32, shown in the second part of step A, to 3 minus 4 times x plus 32. So, when we are distributing like we did in the 4, we have a number pulled out to the side. So not only can we distribute something in, but we can pull something out that we have in both items. So we have an x in both the 3 and the 4, so we also have the distributive property for part B. Now going from part B to part C isn't necessarily a property, and that's okay. If you take 3 minus 4, that's just subtraction, and that gives us a negative 1. And then negative 1 times x becomes negative x in part D. So that property that we have is the multiplication property of negative 1. Okay, so just making sure you match up each step correctly, and if you see a property that you're not sure with, make sure you come in and ask for help. Okay, so your homework again is on page 263 all. Okay, and that is the end of section 2.5.